in this lesson, we are going to continue creating our game's functionality. We started doing that in the previous lesson. We started creating our game manager as well as our UI manager. And today we are going to continue working on these classes. So if you remember, in the last lesson, we pretty much started working on our display method as well as loading questions from our resource folder. So the thing we need to do now is we need to start loading our questions and displaying it on the screen. So we're gonna start creating our UI manager. So first of all, we are going to create a brand new class, or actually not a class, but a struct. So let's create a public struct, and this is going to be called UI manager parameters. So let's create a brand new header, and this is going to be called something like answers options. So this is going to be some of the options. Whenever we're going to display our answers UI elements, we have some options that will affect how these elements will be displayed. So let's create a new float, and let's call this margins. And we also need, of course, the getter. So let's create a public float, and this is going to be called margins, and it will simply going to get and return the private value. So let's actually go back to our UI manager, and let's create a reference to our UI manager parameters. So let's create a new private, and this is going to be UI manager parameters, and let's call this something like parameters. And that's all we need to do. So now let's create a couple of more variables. So the next thing we need to do is we need to have the reference to our game events, because as you remember, our game manager is going to communicate with our UI manager through game events. So let's create a new header, and let's call this references. And this is going to be a private and game events, and let's call this something like events. All right, so now the next thing we need is we need a reference to our answers prefab. So whenever we're going to display a new question, we are going to instantiate a set of question answers. So we need to have the prefab of the answer UI element. So let's create a header, which is going to be called something like UI elements and prefabs. And this is going to be a private. And if you remember, we created this class in the previous lesson, which was called answer data. And this class is going to be associated with our UI element, and this is where we're going to store some of the data, like the answer index. So let's go and let's create an answer in the answer data, and this is going to be called something like answer prefab. All right, so the next thing we need is we need the UI elements. So let's go and let's create a brand new struct, and this is where we're going to store all of our UI elements. And what we also need to do is we need to mark these structs as serializable, so we could actually view these classes inside of our inspector. So first of all, we need to be using system, and we need to add an attribute called serializable, and that will mark this struct as serializable, and it will appear on our inspector. All right, so inside of our UI element struct, we need to create a couple of references. So the first reference is going to be the answers content area. So let's create that. And this is where we're going to store all of our answers. So this is going to be a rect transform, and let's call this something like answers content area. And then let's create a getter, which will return the private variable. All right, so the next thing we need is we need the reference to our question info text object. So this is where we're going to display the actual question. So let's copy this one, and we need to be using actually TextMesh Pro namespace. So we could actually use the TextMesh Pro reference, change this to TextMesh Pro UGY, also the public one, and let's call this something like question info text object. So the next thing we need is we need the score text. So this is this one, and this is where we're going to display our current game final score. So let's go and let's do that. This is also going to be a TextMesh Pro reference, and this needs to be called something like score text. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to, first of all, let's add a little bit of space so that we can actually separate some of the variables. And even though we are not going to necessarily be using these at the moment, but I feel like it's just good to just include everything at once, so then we don't have to worry about it in the future. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to include the high score text, and whenever we're going to finish the game, we're gonna have the high score appear on our final screen. So let's change this to something like high score text. All right, so the next thing is going to be the main canvas, or the main canvas group. And if you go back to our Unity, so this is what we need. And the reason why we need this reference, so whenever we're going to display the resolution screen, we want to disable the functionality of the main canvas so that we couldn't press, for example, next or something else. So we want to kind of make this UI inactive when we are displaying the resolution screen. And let's grab the reference, and this is going to be the canvas group. And let's call this something like main canvas group. All right, so the next reference we need is we need the holder of the finished UI elements. So if you remember, whenever we created the UI elements and whenever we did the resolution screen, we also created these game finish elements that only going to be appear whenever we're going to finish the game. So this is going to be direct transform. And let's call this something like finish UI elements. All right, so we need to add a couple of more references. So let's go here and let's add a little bit of space to separate some of the variables, and let's create a brand new reference. And that reference is going to be the resolution background. As you remember, we're going to change the color of the background depending on what kind of resolution screen we are displaying. So we need to include the image. But to use the image, we need to include the namespace, which is unityengine.ui. And let's call this something like resolution background. So we need a couple of more references. The first one is going to be the resolution state information text. And this is going to be this text. And this text is going to display some of the information. So for example, if we answer the question correctly, or if we answer the question incorrectly, it will display that information in this text object. So let's be a TextMesh Pro object, and let's name this something like resolution state info text. All right, and the final thing we need is going to be the resolution add score text. So let's simply add this, and then I'll show you what it actually is. And let's call this something like score text. For now, that's all the things we need. So let's go back to our UI manager and let's grab the reference to our UI elements. So let's go here and let's create a brand new private, and this is going to be a UI elements, and let's call this something like UI elements. Let's also add a little bit of space. All right, so the next thing we need is we need a list of all answer data. So whenever we're going to instantiate answer data and we're going to display a new question, we want to destroy all the current answers and replace them with new answers. We need to keep track of what kind of answers are in the scene, and for that we are going to create a list of answer data, and let's call this something like answer current answers maybe. And let's say this is going to be a new list of answer data. So for now, this is all the references we need. So now let's go and let's create couple of methods, and the first method we need is going to be on enable as well as on disable, and we are going to subscribe and unsubscribe to some of the methods inside of our game events class. So let's go here, and actually before we do that, we need of course to implement those methods. So the first method we are going to implement is going to be update question UI. So let's go here and let's make that method, and let's call this update question UI. And inside of this method we need the parameter, which is going to be the question. So we need to know what kind of question we want to display on the screen. And if you remember, inside of our game events we have the callback that does just that. So when we are going to subscribe inside of our UI manager to this delegate, and inside of our game manager we are going to invoke this delegate whenever we display a new question. All right, so inside of this method the only thing we are going to do is we are going to display the question information text, and we also going to create a new answers. The first thing we need to do is of course to display the question information. So let's go here and let's say UI elements, which is the private variable that we created, and then let's access our question info text object, the question dot information. So we are going to display our current question information. And the next thing, we need to create answers. So for that, we of course need a new method. So let's go and let's create a brand new method, and let's call this something like create answers. And of course, as a parameter, we also need a question. So we need to know what kind of answers we want to display. So we need a question as the parameter. So inside of our update question UI method, let's simply call this method, and let's pass in the question as a parameter. All right, so inside of our create answers method, the first thing we need to do is we need to erase the current answers. And to do that, we are going to create a brand new method. So let's create a brand new method, and let's call this method something like erase answers. So the only thing we are going to do inside of this method is we are going to destroy every single element inside of this list. So let's create a new for each loop. So let's call this the answer, and we are going to loop through the current answers list. And the only thing we are going to do is we are going to simply destroy the answer game object. And afterwards, after we loop through entire list and destroy all of the elements, we are going to simply clear the list. So inside of our create answers method, let's simply call our erase answers. And after we erase all the answers, we can start creating the new answers. So the first thing we need is we need a new float, and this float is going to be called the offset, and by default is going to be 0 minus parameters.margins. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to create a for loop. Not for each loop, but for loop, because we want to know the current index. And we are going to loop through all of our question answers. And what we are going to do inside of this loop is we're simply going to create a new answer data. And let's call this something like new answer. And we are going to say that we want to instantiate a brand new answer prefab, which is the reference we created. So the next thing we want is we want to reference our parent. So where we want to parent this object. Parent is inside of our UI elements. So let's say UI elements dot, and what we want is we want answers content area. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to position the answer in a correct place, because if we just instantiate the question, we are going to have all the answers stacked up on top of each other. Of course, we could create the layout group, which is the component that comes with Unity's UI system, but I don't really like using the layout group, because a lot of times I got a lot of performance issues by using these type of components. Obviously, for this type of game, it probably wouldn't make any difference, but I kind of like to create my own ordering system. And actually, the ordering system that we are going to create is going to be really simple. So I feel like it doesn't make any difference. And it's actually going to be more, useful to know how we can actually do something like that. So the first thing we want is we want to update the data inside of our answer data. So what we need to do is, first of all, we need to go back to our answer data class, and we need to create a brand new method, and this is going to be a public void, and this public void is going to be called update data. All right, so inside of this method, it needs a couple of parameters. The first parameter is, of course, the information, and the next one is the index. So let's create this string, and let's call this info, and let's also create the integer, which is going to be the index. All right, so what we need to do is we need to say that information text object dot text is going to be equals to info, and our answer index is going to be equals to index. All right, so next let's create a couple of more methods, and the first one is going to be called reset, and the next one is going to be called switch state, and the final one is going to be called update UI. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to create a new private bool value, which is going to be called checked, and let's say by default it's going to be false. And inside of our reset, let's set the checked to be equals to false, and let's also call update UI. Inside of our switch state, we are going to say that checked is going to be equals to opposite of the current state. So if, for example, checked is true, then it will be equals to opposite state, and that means it's going to be equals to false. And afterwards, we of course want to update the UI. And inside of our update UI, what we are going to do is we are going to say that toggle which is the image dot sprite, is going to be equals to, well, either unchecked toggle sprite or checked toggle sprite. And we need to determine whenever the checked is equals to true or is equals to false. So we can do that really easily. We can say that toggle.sprite is going to be equals, and then we'd say if checked is equals to true, then we say that the sprite is going to be equals to checked toggle sprite. And this pretty much means if checked is not equals to true, then we say that the sprite is going to be unchecked toggle sprite. Alright, so inside of our switch state, we actually want to do another thing. And what we want to do is we want to update the current picked answers. So for that, we need to have the reference to our game events. So let's create a brand new header, and let's call this header something like references. And in here, we need to create a new private serialized field, and let's say this is going to be game events, and let's call this events. And inside of our switch state, the first thing we want is we want to check if game events dot if update question answer is not equals to null. If it's not equals to null, what we're going to do is we're simply going to update the question answer. And what we need is, of course, we need to send in the actual answer, which is the answer data. So let's simply say that we want to send as a parameter this, which is this class. Alright, and this is all we need to do inside of our answer data class. So let's go back to our UI manager. Alright, so now what we need to do is we need to call our update data method, and what we need to pass is the information and the index. So the information is going to be the answer, which is the current answer in the list dot information, and the index is simply going to be the y, which is the current element. Alright, so afterwards we need to position this new element on our screen. So what we need to say is we need to say the new answer dot rec, which we cannot actually access at the moment. So we need to go to our answer data, and we need to create a rec transform reference. First of all, let's create a private, which is going to be rec transform, and let's call this something like rec. And then let's create a getter, which is going to be a public rec transform. Let's call this rec. Then let's say we want to create a getter, and the first thing we want to do is we want to check if rec, which is the private variable, if it's equals to null. If it's equals to null, what we are going to do is we are going to simply get the component, which is going to be rec transform. And if we actually return a null value, meaning that this object does not contain the rec transform component, and we can do that by using this operator. So what this operator means is that we are going to try to get the component, but if we return null value, we are going to do something else. And what we are going to do is we are going to add the rec transform component. So let's call the method that is going to be called add component. And then of course we need to specify the type, and this is going to be a rec transform, and that's all we need to do. And afterwards we are simply going to return private variable. Alright, so let's go back to our UI manager, and what we need to do is we need to access our rec, which is going to be this public getter, and let's say that the rec.anchored position is going to be equals to new vector 2, and for the x we are going to say 0, and for the y we want to pass in the offset. Alright, so after we position our element, what we need to do is we need to update the offset. So let's say that the offset is going to be equals to minus equals new answer dot rec dot size delta dot y, and it's going to be plus parameters dot margins. Alright, so the next thing we want is we want to resize the content area. So let's say that the UI elements dot answers content area dot size delta is going to be equals to new vector 2. And for the x, we don't want to change the x, so let's simply say that the x is going to be the original x value, and the y needs to be equals to offset. But we cannot just say that this is going to be equals to offset, because the offset is going to be the negative value, but we need to turn this offset into a positive value. So what we need to do is simply just multiply it by -1, and that will turn the offset from negative to positive, which is what we need. Alright, so the last thing we need to do is we need to say current answers dot add, and we need to add this new answer to the list. Alright, and that's all we need to do with this function. So we simply erase the current answers, and then we simply created a new answers. Alright, so what we need to do now is we need to subscribe to some of the delegates. So let's say events dot update question UI plus equals update question UI. And also let's unsubscribe on disable. Never forget to do that because it will cause you some issues. So let's go back to our game manager, and on start, let's uncomment the display call. And inside of our display, let's invoke this delegate. So we can actually test this and see how this works. So let's go back to Unity. And the first thing we want to reference all the references. So we have a bunch of references that we need to, attach. So the first thing is game events. So let's go and let's create new game events. So let's go here and let's create a brand new folder, and let's call this something like prefabs. And let's go here and let's say quiz new game events. We should actually make this hide in inspector, and let's simply make this current final score variable to hide in inspector. All right, so let's go back to managers and let's reference the game events inside of our game manager and UI manager. And the next thing is reference a bunch of UI elements. And let's also add a little bit of margin. So let's put it like 5. All right, so the next thing we need to reference is the answer prefab. So for that, we need to create a new answer UI element. So let's go to our answers content area and let's create a brand new image. So this is going to be the background. All right, so we want to make this element stretch on the top. So press Shift and Alt and press on this button. So the next thing is to change some settings like offset, for example, and the height. So for the offset, I want to set the offset to be 10, something like this. And the height, I want it to be something like 85. All right, so let's rename this object to be something like answer prefab. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to change the source image, because at the current moment it's just rectangle, which doesn't look really good. So let's go to source image, let's press on this button and let's select the UI mask sprite. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to add the button component so that we can actually turn this element to be clickable. For the navigation, let's make this to be none because we don't need any navigation. Then the next thing we want to add is the answer data script, and this is where we're going to store all of our answer information. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to add the toggle icon as well as the label or the information text. So let's go and let's create a brand new image, which is going to be the child of the answer prefab, and let's make this checkbox to be stretched and anchored to the left. For the position, let's set it to be something like 22.5, and also for the top, let's set it to something like 70.5, and let's do the same for the bottom. For the width, let's set it to be something like 65 or maybe 50. And let's also change the source image to be something like, which is the checkbox unchecked sprite. You can obviously use your own sprites, or if you want, you can get this project on the GitHub and you can get these sprites as well. All right, so the next thing we want is we want to add the text. So let's go and let's add the Text Mesh Pro text, and let's make this text to be stretched to fill in the entire area. So let's, for example, change this to something like possible answer, just so that we could see how the text looks like. All right, so now let's change some of the font settings. The first one is, of course, the font asset, and what we are going to use is Roboto Light. Let's also make it bold to kind of stand out a little bit more. Let's set the size to be something like 35. Let's also fix the alignment to be anchored to the left and to the middle. I think that's all we need to do for our settings. Actually, let's go now to the extra settings and let's disable Raycast Target, because we want to make this answer prefab to be interactable so that we could press on this button and we could toggle this answer. But if we, for example, set this to be Raycast Target, we wouldn't be able to press on the button as long as we press on this element. So we want to disable Raycast Target so that we wouldn't trigger any click events on this element. We also want to do exactly the same thing on our image. So let's simply go to our image and let's uncheck Raycast Target. All right, so now let's change some of the offset of the information text, and let's set this offset, left offset, to be something like 85. And I think that looks pretty all right. All right, so now let's rename these elements. Let's rename the image to be something like checkbox. And let's rename the text object to be something like info. So what I also want to add to make it kind of look better, I also want to add the label. So let's go and let's add a brand new image, and let's make this image to be stretched and anchored to the left. Let's set the width of this image to be something like 11.7. And let's also change the UI sprite to be something like UI sprite. And let's change the color, which is particularly the alpha channel, to be something like 15, or actually maybe 10. It's better. And I think that looks quite alright. You can obviously make it look much better. I just doing it really simple just for the tutorial purposes. You can obviously do it much better. So now let's reference all the UI elements. So for the text object, we want to reference the info text object. For the toggle, we want to reference the checkbox image. We also want to reference the sprites. So let's reference the unchecked sprite as well as the checked sprite. And also we want to reference the game events, so let's simply go here and let's reference that as well. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to add the onClick event. So whenever we're going to press on this answer, we are going to check it or uncheck it. So let's press to add new onClick event, and let's drag this component, and for the function let's use switch state. Let's also rename this image to be something like label, and let's also disable the raycast target. And this is all we need to do for our answer. So let's go to prefabs folder, and let's drag and drop this answer prefab to make the prefab. And let's also delete this because we don't need it. So now let's go back to our managers, and let's reference our answer prefab, which is the one we created. So now let's reference the other UI elements. So the first thing we need to reference is answers content area, and this is going to be this element. So for the question information text object, we need to reference our question information text. For the score text, we need to reference our score counter. For the resolution background, let's reference the resolution screen. For the state information text, let's reference the state information text. And also for the score, let's reference the score text. Okay, so now we need to reference the high score text, which is inside of our game finished elements. And this is the text that we need to reference. We also want to reference the main canvas group, which is the canvas group that lies on the main canvas. And we also want to reference the finished UI elements holder, which is of course this one. And that's all we need to do with our references. We also want to set the margins. You can of course try this out and see what works for you, but I found that 15 looks quite alright. And that's all we need to do. Alright, so let's try to test this game. So let's press play, and we should have all the answers displaying, and we don't. It's only because we don't actually created any answers. So let's go back to our questions, and let's try to create some of the answers. So let's say for this question, the answers are going to be, for example, these ones, and this is going to be the correct answer. We are not going to determine that at the moment, but let's just try to see if we can display the answers correctly. So let's try to create a couple of more answers, and let's try to play the game, and let's see what happens. And as you can see, we are displaying the question and its answers. We are not really getting a random questions, and it's only because we need to initiate the state, which is initiate the random seed, and we're not really currently doing that, and that's why we're not really getting anything random. Let's go back to our game manager, and let's fix a couple of issues. Is we need to initiate the random seed, and the thing we need to do is, first of all, we need to create a new variable, and let's call this something like seed, and the seed is going to be equals to unity engine dot random dot range, and we need to get the random value, and this is going to be our seed. You can of course use something like current time or current environment time, for example. So something like system.environment.tickCount. You can use that to initiate your seed, but it's not really random as far as I tested it. So it's not the best way what I'm going to show you, but it will give you definitely the random results. So let's say unity engine.random.range, and let's pick a random value between int.min value and int.max value. So it will give you the random value between the minimum value and the maximum value of the integer. And then we need to initiate the seed, which is going to be unity engine.random.init state. And we need to pass in, of course, the seed, and this is going to be this. And that's all we need to do. Let's also delete this because we don't really need it anymore. And let's go back to Unity and let's see if this works. Obviously now we have only 3 questions, so we can't really get anything, well, that interesting, but as you can see, we are definitely getting more random results this time. Alright guys, so this video is quite long already, so I think we're going to cut this video here and we are going to continue in the next lesson. So we are halfway done on making our game functionality. We should finish it in the next or in the 2 more episodes, and that should be it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and found it useful, and I'll see you all hopefully in the next lesson.